You are listening to the Timelapse History Podcast. Every episode will focus on different events from world history, ranging from the beginning of time itself to the more recent events of the 20th century. With help from historians, archaeologists, university professors and more, our aim is to take you on a time-travelling journey through the events, the stories, and the characters which have captured the imaginations of history lovers worldwide. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Ida Milne, who is kindly joining us from Ireland. Dr. Milne is an Irish academic historian and lecturer of European history at Carlow College. She specialises in the history of diseases and in particular the 1918 influenza pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu. Dr. Milne is also the author of Stacking Coffins and Protestant and Irish, both available in all major bookstores. Ida has also appeared on a range of BBC documentaries and podcasts, as well as featuring on a number of TV shows such as The Sean O'Rourke Show, Morning Ireland, and The History Show. This is episode 2 of the Timelapse History Podcast, where we will be focusing on the 1918 flu pandemic and its devastating impact on both Ireland and the world. Hello, Dr. Milne, and welcome to the show. I'd like to begin with your own personal interest with the 1918 flu. What do you find so fascinating about this pandemic?
It's partly that it was ignored by historians and not seen as a thing. When I started to research it originally about 2006, I thought it was something that was interesting for its immediacy. And as I began finding families who had been affected by it, even 100 years later, I began to realize it had enormously long legs as a personal or familial impact. And I think that made me much more fascinated with it than as an immediate crisis.
And you have a book on the subject called Stacking Coffins. What was your inspiration for this?
I was a journalist and I went back to education in about 2000. And I did a history degree and became fascinated with the idea of doing further research and staying in the history field. And I had come across this topic as a journalist when my editor had asked me to do something on the 1918 sinking of the mailboat Leinster, sunk by a German torpedo in off the east coast of Ireland, killing 600 people. And as I read through the newspapers, I discovered that as many people were dying each week in Ireland then from the Spanish flu, and that indeed even some of the ambulance bearers who were bringing people from that crisis, the survivors, were going down with flu even as they were carrying the people away from the wreckage of the boat. So when I was doing an MA, I was looking for a topic to do that hadn't been done before. And I asked the director of the course, I said, is it possible this would be a suitable topic? Because nothing's ever been done on it before, so why haven't people done it? And he said, well, are there the resources? And I was able to answer that quite quickly because it was covered throughout the newspapers and throughout the death statistics. So that's how I began. And then I went on to do a PhD on it, and my book developed from that.
Your book contains personal interviews from survivors of this pandemic. How did these conversations impact you as a historian?
It was a game changer. It showed me the real people, the faces behind these statistics, behind the news stories. It's something else I find incredibly moving to do is to go to graves and to try and build stories from, seeing the names on those graves, going back to the death statistics, trying to find more family stories. And in some way, I think it gives consolation to families when, as a historian, you can give them back something of the story that they've lost, from this family member who's died many, many years ago. It makes their death less puzzling, and it sets context for them and makes them part of a wider community that didn't just have this individual loss, but were part of a collective and global loss.
Were there any interviews which particularly stood out to you?
Oh, yeah, there was one I really loved. It was a guy called Tommy Christian, who actually lived very near me in North Kildare, outside County Dublin, but 20 kilometres west of Dublin. So I was able to go and talk to him quite a lot once I found him. He was 5 when he caught the flu, and he remembered it very clearly. He blamed it for actually killing his mother, even though his mother technically died from TB about a year later. He reckoned she'd never been the same, and that flu had actually hastened her death from TB, which radically changed his family story, because he and his sister were farmed out to different members of their extended family, to 2 different aunts. And his father remarried, and they were never included in the new family. So that pointed me to 2 things. One was to check, did deaths from flu reap people early from other diseases that they already had, things like cancer, heart disease, etc. And indeed, I found that it did. And the second was, I hadn't really thought of the impact that it had on families where they lost a parent, and what happened to them in the context of those times compared to what would happen now, when families would get a lot more financial support or other kind of supports like psychological support, grievance counselling, things like that just weren't available back then. So his was a really influential interview for me. There was one other interview that was very influential, was a lady called Stella McConnell Larkin. And her grandfather was the famous trade unionist, James Larkin. And she spoke to me many years before I'd actually interviewed her about the flu, about how her mother had grown up in the tenements of Dublin, which were really atrocious places. They lived in a 1-room tenement that had no toilet, no running water. They had to cook over an open fire. They all slept in the one bed. Her mother was one of 10 children, and the only one of those 10 that survived over the age of 5. So this really pointed me to another big puzzle about the flu. Why was it not more part of our history books? It's really only in the since the 1970s onwards, that it started to be included in history books in any major way. And a lot of work has been done since then. But really what it pointed to me, she had one aunt who died age 4 3/4 from the flu. And what her story and her account of her family's tragedy with infectious disease, like they died from things like measles, against which we now have vaccination, from infant diarrhea, really because of poor refrigeration and poor hygiene. It was very difficult to wash and keep clean under those kind of circumstances. So it really pointed me to the idea that one of the reasons why it wasn't regarded as all that big a thing at the time in some sectors was because health overall was so very poor at that stage. And people had very little expectation that all their children would survive to adulthood. And in most families, when you look back at census records, you'll see there is a death along the way, at least of one child, but maybe more.
Compared to other diseases throughout history, how deadly was the 1918 flu?
It's considered one of the 3 deadliest in all of time, that it ranks alongside the plagues of Justinian in the 500s and 600s, and alongside the Black Death in the medieval or early modern age. Of course, it kills far more than either of them because the world's population is much bigger. But we're really inexact about how many it killed, because we can't, for various reasons. Russia was in revolution. Some countries weren't collecting death statistics at the time. We can't be very precise. So upwards of 50 million, perhaps as big as 100 million.
What was so unique and terrifying about this virus?
I've heard accounts of where somebody could get up in the morning, seem quite well, and by lunchtime they'd be dead. They'd have gone to work or something and they'd just die suddenly. So there were different presentations of it. Generally, it was like a typical flu, but some people got very severe nosebleeds that wouldn't be so typical of flu. Some people got very severe gastric impacts, and sometimes people could be sick, die quite suddenly, but other people might take 8-9 days before they'd succumb. And then quite a few people died from pneumonia arising from the flu in the first place, because of course in those days there were no antibiotics that would fix a bacterial pneumonia arising from influenza. One of the unusual features about this virus was that it struck young, previously healthy, very strong adults. So 25, 35-year-olds seemed to be one of the groups that it particularly targeted. Of course, it also affected the under fives, which were a very vulnerable sector in society then. That meant that it also impacted on people like soldiers, sports people, and on the parents of small children, because that would be typically the group that age group would be parents. It's not a group that's usually typically affected by seasonal influenza. One of the reasons it was given to me by a scientist friend of mine was that they might get a cytokine storm, which has been explained to me in kind of lay language, because I'm not a scientist, as being an overreaction of the immune system to the invading virus, and that your body goes in overdrive trying to get it out. And people in that group would tend to have very strong immune systems. So it's more severe in their cases. We see cytokine storms in COVID as well. And another theory that I'd have is that a lot of the advice at the time was to stay in bed until you were well better, or that you might get this pneumonia afterwards. But there were very few supports for income at the time. And if you worked in a service industry in particular, like something like the police or health system, you might feel obliged to go back to work because your colleagues were under so much pressure. And I have at least one story of a policeman who did just that, a guy called James Delaney, who was, I think, 28. And he went back to work having had flu in December 1918 and died in January 1919, actually on the job as a Dublin Metropolitan Police officer.
What are the most popular theories on the origins of the 1918 flu?
There are several animals that can be vectors of influenza. So you could have pigs, birds, I think most kinds of birds. But I think after an awful lot of work by scientists, they've come to the conclusion that this was actually an avian influenza. Professor John Oxford, the British virologist, spoke back I heard him talk in Trinity about 12 or 14 years ago, talking about how the conditions for the army during the First World War were really conducive to the developing of a new kind of flu. Because in those days, you kept the food for the army live because of refrigeration. So you had both pigs and things like geese, ducks, and hens kept very close to where the soldiers were housed. And his theory was that it probably developed at either side of the English Channel, between Aldershot and Ypres, where the troops were being moved backwards and forwards very quickly, were being housed in very close conditions with those live food for the animals. And diseases often circulate, well, they always circulate in conditions of war in those days very rapidly. So he thought it might have evolved there. That was a development of an earlier kind of flu. There was a disease circulating in London and in some of the combatant armies since about 1915, where the bodies turned black. It was called sometimes pyrexia, a temperature of unknown origin. And there's a suspicion that this is an earlier version of that flu. But there's also a theory that it started in Fort Riley in Kansas. And they're very precise about this, that it was a cook called Albert Gitchell and that it started at a certain date in March 1918. But I think now we've learned to dismiss that one because we have earlier incidences of flu outbreaks before then. So it's unusual that both the British and the Americans claim the flu for their own.
Where did the name Spanish flu come from?
It comes because there was censorship amongst the warring countries at the time. So their newspapers generally didn't talk too much about the flu. Unusually, the Irish newspapers do talk a lot about it. I've noticed the Scottish newspapers don't mention it all that much. There was wartime censorship of the newspapers, but Spain wasn't a warring country. So when the flu hit, the young king of Spain, Alfonso XIII, and several thousand of his courtiers, I think about 3,000 of them, there was major coverage in the press because of that. So that's considered the reason why it's called Spanish flu. But at that stage, we have evidence that it had already impacted all the combatant armies in the First World War.
And was it known by any other names at the time?
It was called different names in different places, and typically people were blaming, the enemy. So some places it was called the Russian flu, some places it was called the Naples flu, but the Spanish name was the one that struck a lot more. And when the 2009 pandemic came, and it was then called the Mexican flu, I do remember my local pharmacist who was Spanish saying they're blaming the Hispanics again for this. There's a historic record there. And one of the really interesting things now is that early on, people would have been calling COVID the Wuhan pandemic. And both in 2009 and now, the World Health Organization moved very quickly to take away from this geographic naming, because particularly in the case of Mexico, it was having an impact on the Mexican tourism industry, even though the center of the flu was in Mexico's capital city, which was thousands of miles away from the tourism centers near the coast.
Can you speak on the 4 successive waves of the flu?
They had slightly different timings in different parts of the world. So the first wave comes, generally speaking, somewhere between March and the early summer of 1918. In Ireland, it doesn't come until May 1918 and ends in mid-July. And generally, that's considered to be quite a mild wave, but quite clearly in the army, because that's the main time the army would have been still active, because a lot of the fighting is more or less done by October 1918 when the second wave comes. So it seemed to be a lot more severe in the army than it was in the civilian populations at that stage. The most lethal for civilian populations was generally the second wave, which was in October through December 1918, certainly true in Ireland. There was a third wave in many places in spring of 1919, and in Ireland that came from the middle of February until the middle of April. Some places had a fourth wave, places like Japan, I think, and South America, and up closer to the Arctic Circle, there was a fourth wave. It was places that hadn't yet spread to at that stage.
On that note, which communities suffered the most as a result of this pandemic?
Oh, an intriguing question. I think when you're looking at healthcare today, as much as back then or during any pandemic, you're always going to say that the most deprived communities suffer the worst. So in Ireland, when I look at it, we have absolutely no records that I know of for the Irish traveller population and the impact on them during the 1918 flu, but I have no doubt it was dreadful, because they always have an inferior health service or access to health. In Ireland, the other worst impact was on certain sectors of the working class, particularly those living in those awful tenements that I was describing in Dublin and other parts of the country, where access to hygiene is very difficult, where you don't have running water or flush toilets, but also places where our sectors of the community where income supports are really poor. So a lot of the people who suffered worst were also people who didn't have regular incomes, who might be employed by the half day or the day and had no savings. And in those days, of course, didn't have access to something like the dough, which was a really crucial factor in survival, in my view, in this pandemic for countries which introduced it. So people had financial supports. Whereas in 1918, a worker who was in that very challenging position, whose family lived in a tenement, who could see the suffering that their family were going through, would feel obliged to get out of bed and go to work even when they really didn't feel well enough to do it, if they got a chance at some work. And I think that picture is probably replicated around the world. There are particular stories, the Inuit, but particularly in Alaska, where it would come into a village and maybe 50% of them would die. Whereas more typically in the rest of the world, about 2.5 or 3% of those who caught it tended to be what we regard as the rate of death. So most people survived. So I think anywhere where there was a challenge to a population, a population that was poor anyway, and didn't have good access to a clean environment or a supportive environment, I suppose, and whose finances were challenged as well. The poor, always suffered most from diseases like that.
Did the average Irish person have knowledge of this pandemic before its arrival in Ireland?
I suppose for some people it was completely new. You have to remember, literacy was at lower levels than it was now, but first of all, I've seen a lot of evidence in the newspapers where they're talking about the impact that it's having in other countries. Like the Irish newspapers talk about the impact on places like Munich and parts of Germany, which may be their subtle way of saying that it is in the German army as well. But it also talks about the impact on things like the international stock markets, on diamond mining with De Beers in South Africa. And they know quite well that it is traveling around Europe and around the world. And this is in the newspapers. And some of the people I interviewed spoke to me about how, as children, there was one particular lady, Elizabeth, who lived in Dublin, and she told me that she remembered her parents and their friends at a cocktail party in Dublin, huddled together and talking about this dreadful disease that was on its way. And as soon as she as a child came close to them, they'd shut up. So she was already reading. So she went to the newspapers to find out about it from that. So they did know. And the treatments are spoken about in the newspapers all the time. They're very strange treatments, but they are things like gargling with creosote, a tincture of creosote now, or permanganate of potash, and how such and such pharmacist has recommended this, or, so the newspapers are full of these kind of cures.
When did the flu first arrive in Ireland and the UK?
In the UK, I think it's April, but in Ireland, it's in May 1919. So obviously it comes in through the ports for both of us. If it doesn't originate here, it has to at the time. So you see increased infection around the port cities first. So in Ireland, it would be in Belfast and in Dublin in particular, but also the smaller ports up and down the north and the east coast. Places like Dundalk that would have a regular shipping across the Irish Sea were struck quite early. And the Dublin newspapers talk about this mysterious illness impacting Howth and Kingstown, which are both places with ferry contacts to Britain, over to Anglesey or Liverpool. And in Britain, I think it's London is the first big city to be hit by it, but also I think down along the south coast.
What preventative measures did the Irish government take to tackle the virus?
The government in Ireland was very not proactive at the time. And the local government board for Ireland, there are three different local government boards in these islands. There's the one for England and Wales, the one for Scotland, and the one for Ireland. And they control both taxation and things like the poor law dispensary health system, the forerunner of, our contemporary health systems. And it seems to me that both in England and Wales are not so familiar with the position in Scotland. And in Ireland, they were quite non-intrusive, I suppose, and left it to the poor law unions at local levels, certainly in Ireland. But you'd see constant complaints from journalists and from local doctors saying, why aren't the Custom House people, which was where the local government board seat was, why aren't they doing more about this?
What popular treatments were there at the time to deal with the virus?
A lot of them are quite strange by our days. For example, first of all, you don't have that much over-the-counter medicine. So you wouldn't have access to things like paracetamol to reduce a fever. So your dispensary doctor would probably, if you got to see them, and they did really work around the clock trying to treat people, they would treat you with things like quinine to reduce the fever. Now we think that would be a dangerous way to reduce fever, because quinine can have a lot of side effects, like, for example, it can cause blindness in large doses. Aspirin was quite new, but a lot of the aspirin was made by Bayer, the German company. So there was some small fear, and certainly there were sort of rumors that Bayer had actually, in America in particular, that Bayer had infected the aspirin boxes with the disease. There are always these rumors when anything like this happens. Other treatments, as I've mentioned earlier, was things like permanganate of potash and the gargle with a tincture of creosote. But more typically, people would be fed a diet of gruel, very watery porridge. And people have told me about this. And they also had linseed poultices. So that would be linseed soaked in hot water, put between two layers of cotton and placed on the chest of the sufferer. And that was supposed to really relieve the breathing symptoms. The most common medicament was alcohol of some form, usually made into a kind of a hot toddy with hot water and a bit of sugar if they had it. But sugar was in quite short supply at the time. And one of my interviewees, Tommy Christian, who I mentioned earlier, he had his first taste of hot toddy when he was 5 years of age, and he said it was actually magical. When the doctors spoke about that, this could have been given out in hospitals too. They said that it didn't cure any of the patients, this hot toddy idea, but it certainly gave them a more peaceful and happy journey to the hereafter, was the way one writer expressed it. It was also believed to have antiviral properties, that it could kill the bug. So some of the doctors, before they went into a house with flu, would gargle with whiskey.
What role did World War I have in spreading the virus?
I suppose the war was the single biggest long-term movement of people that we've ever had globally, because you have ships and troops being moved all over the world. You have a mass displacement of civilian populations. I think it's something like 10 million people were moved. So there's no study done on how it moved through civilian populations that I know of, but there's a lot of work being done looking in particular at how America's entry into the war in 1917 and the fact that by early spring of 1918, when the first wave of the flu is happening, the American troops are being rushed across the Atlantic as fast as they can come, and that there is an awful amount of flu spreading on those transport ships across the Atlantic. Huge amounts. That also impacts on Ireland because their first port of call is generally Ireland. And there is a convoy system around Ireland and Britain at that stage to protect troops from the U-boats to protect all shipping from the U-boats. But when the soldiers come off the ships and into the community, it spreads flu in the community in Ireland, both in Lough Swilly from British and American troops up there, and in Cork. They're the two main stopping points for the different allies troops at the time. So after a while, when the navies begin to realize what's happening, they introduce disinfection procedures, that they keep the soldiers off the ships until they check and see whether they have temperatures and things like that. If they're free of temperatures, they're let on board. They're also disinfected more. Some of the navies moved the bunks, which could be quite close together, to 6 feet apart rather than 3 feet apart. And they took other measures to stop it spreading on board the ships.
And I imagine trench warfare must have been a big factor in spreading the flu.
Yeah, I remember very vividly when I started doing my PhD, one of the lecturers then, Catherine Sims in Trinity College in Dublin, said she remembered being told by an uncle of hers who had been in the war as a doctor that there were just rows of bodies, black bodies, in the trenches, dead from the flu. It must have been incredibly distressing to see for the other soldiers. Rows and rows of black bodies. Because this flu infected your lungs so heavily, your lungs weren't able to work doing their normal oxygenation. So the bodies turned quite black because you no longer have a nice red blood supply. It's purple or blackish, quite gruesome. And something else that I think Howard Phillips has looked at is that not only would the flu spread, but that, make people ill or kill them in the army conditions, but also that even when they've recovered, it might impact on their eyesight or for a few weeks afterwards. So their shooting might be quite not as accurate as it might have been before. And I think most people, when they catch flu, they don't generally feel well, even when they've technically recovered from it for some weeks afterwards. So the armies wouldn't be in the same kind of tip-top condition they were in before as well. But it would fly through different camps and knock a whole camp out. Like it would knock whole towns out when it impacted. So you can imagine then what it did under camp conditions, where the soldiers are kept very close together. And particularly when they're up at the front and conditions are ever more cramped and sanitation is very difficult anyhow.
What were the long-term effects on the survivors of the flu?
certainly Spanish flu impacted on the individual sufferers. Like, for example, some of the people that I interviewed, there was one guy called R.B. McDowell who caught it as a 5-year-old boy living in Belfast in a very well-off family at the time. They could get the services of a private doctor. They could manage to engage a nurse to look after the family when they were sick with the flu. The nurse actually ended up dying herself. But when I met him, he was in his 90s. He was wearing a scarf and a heavy overcoat, even inside. And when you saw pictures of him, even in summer, he was always wearing the same gear. So the question I didn't ask him, which I should have, was, has it left you with a lifelong paranoia or concern? Not paranoia, I suppose is the wrong word. Concern about your health. That does it damage confidence in people's health going forwards when they experience something like this? And I think in a way he answered that question that I didn't ask, because when I shook hands with him and said, how are you, as you do when you meet somebody, he said, well, they tell me I'm very good for a man at my age, and proceeded to tell me his top and bottom blood pressure ranking. So it was very clear that he had a lifelong concern with his health. And that did come from flu. He told me that it impacted on his choice of career, that as when he was starting to decide what he should do as a 15 or 16-year-old, that he had still been sick for 10 years and that he'd played the invalid card quite often when he wanted to get out of things he didn't want to do, like playing sport. He said that the bar, as in being called to the bar and becoming a barrister, which was a family profession, was definitely out because it was considered too tough, and that the army was never going to be an option. So he chose what in those days was a relatively sedate, I suppose, occupation, went into academia, became a historian. Not one that I would advise to anybody with poor health now. But, it had those kind of impacts. It also impacted on families where they lost parents. Sometimes families could be completely orphaned, that they'd lose both parents. So that wouldn't just mean losing your parents, but it might also mean losing the family home, because often in those days, if your parents had a job, the job could go with a house, like if you're a school teacher or a prison warder or something like that, or worked in the post office, you might have a job, a house that went with it. Some families decided to migrate to get away from the sadness, or because maybe the breadwinner had died, so the surviving parent would have to get a job and maybe move somewhere else for that job. So that also left children without support networks, that their wider family or community that they knew before.
What have we learnt from the 1918 flu pandemic?
The question about what we learn from pandemics is always, one of the things that historians ask. And I think one of the things we can say from the Spanish flu is we didn't listen. We didn't learn enough. And I think that's one of the things I keep saying about COVID now, is we can't just let it go away and try and forget, because that is a pattern with society. We try to move on. We're scared. One of my interviewees said to me, the reason he thought it wasn't remembered was because it came back in these 3 waves, and that by then everybody was afraid to mention it in case they tempted it to come back again.
Is the 1918 strain of the flu still around in some form?
What I'm told by a virologist friend of mine, Kim Roberts, is that it was the dominant strain circulating until another pandemic came along in 1957. And then that strain became the dominant circulating strain until another pandemic came along in 1968. And then that strain circulated. But that sometime in the 1970s, the 1918 strain started circulating again. And they reckon, or the guess is that it escaped from some kind of secure location where it was kept, and that it circulated again, I think, until 2009, as far as I know. But that it is included in some way in the current versions of flu virus that we have, that there is a kind of a memory there of it.
I think we'll end it there, Dr. Milne. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Oh, you're very welcome, and good luck with it.
All the best. Thanks again.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.